In 2006, the world was introduced to Red Steel. While ambitious, the game quickly revealed the shortcomings of the Wii Remote. In 2009, a sequel to Red Steel was unveiled, but aside from the title, it was different in every way. So let's go back in time to look at the game's reveal and a bit of its marketing, then at the game as it launched, and finally, the best way to play it now. Let's dive in to Red Steel 2. By all accounts, the Wii was a huge success, but one glaring issue was that the Wii Remote was very limited in what it could do. To help address this, in 2009, Nintendo released the Wii Motion Plus, an add-on that clipped into the bottom of the Wii Remote that made it much more capable of accurately tracking motion. Now, the first Red Steel was notorious for its sword fighting not quite working like its marketing had shown, so it was no surprise when Ubisoft announced that the sequel would make use of the Motion Plus in order to fully realize the series' ambitions. What was a surprise, however, was everything else about the sequel. At E3 in 2009, we got our first glimpse of it, and basically, despite there being a number 2 in the name, it was a complete reboot. Whereas in the first game you traveled to real-world locations like LA and Japan, and the story saw you take control of a man named Scott who set out to save his fiancée from the Yakuza, this time around you're playing as a nameless cowboy samurai who's part of a clan known as the Kusagari. The main gist of this story is that some event happened in the past that forced you to leave town for a while, and now you're back. But in your absence, your whole clan has been wiped out, making you the last of your kind. And now, it's up to you to avenge their deaths. You'll explore western ghost towns and meet a few characters who play into the story along the way. In lieu of the pseudo-realistic look of the first title, the sequel is cel-shaded, similar to something like Borderlands. Now this allows for much more stylized appearance, and also undoubtedly helped to free up some performance, as this game targets 60 frames per second, which is double that of its predecessor. Also, unlike the first game, where the shooting and sword fighting were completely separate, Red Steel 2 would let you shoot and slash anytime you wanted, depending on what method you preferred or what may work best for certain situations. In addition, you could hold out your sword, twist and turn it, or just slash in any direction, and you'll immediately see your actions happen in the game. This entirely new approach opened up a whole new set of gameplay possibilities, and leading up to the game's launch, the marketing would emphasize this new focus.
So everyone's asking, does the Wii Motion Plus really make Red Steel 2 the most accurate sword fighting game ever? Well, we hired a top team of testers to make sure it is. The sword literally follows your every move, from deflecting bullets to killer swings, and when the battle heats up, you can switch from sword to gun faster than ever. Hey, great job, dude.
Red Steel 2, rated T for teen.
By all accounts, Ubisoft seemed determined to avoid making the mistakes it had made with the first game all over again. The game would finally hit store shelves in March of 2010. By this point, the Wii Motion Plus had been on the market for several months, and very few games had actually required the add-on. Wii Sports Resort was far and away the main title associated with it, especially since they were bundled together. But a game with a fully fleshed out adventure still hadn't been seen, so Red Steel 2, much like how the first game had an opportunity to show what the Wii Remote could do, once again had a chance to break new ground. In fact, the development team had dubbed it the first game in an entirely new genre, the first-person brawler. So, did they deliver on their expectations? Thankfully, for the most part, yeah. The game does a great job of making good use of the Motion Plus, but it was not easy. Much research and work had been done to iron out issues with the newfound control scheme, namely getting players to actually understand how to pull moves off. A few months after the game launched, the creative director, Jason Vandenberg, gave a talk at GDC Europe where he addressed some of the challenges his team faced.
I made a creed, a saying for my designers, right? We're not interested in tutorials in motion control. We are making lessons. We need a human being on screen showing us what to do, and this is where enter the Wii Girl. First, we show the motion. We force you. You actually can't cancel that within the first second. And then she is doing the motion. We learned that if we put a cowboy hat and made her look like a hero and did it animated, nobody would look.
The end result is a slew of tutorials that do kind of overstay their welcome.
And we required the player to repeat it 3 to 5 times. Oh, the reviewers loved us.
But Ultimately, I'd say they get the job done, because at no point while playing this game did I ever question how to execute any of the moves.
I never saw anyone pick up the controller, go through that tutorial, and not be able to succeed at the combos. Not just at attacking. Everyone could do the combos, which was astonishing because in the previous version, no one knew the combos existed.
Vandenberg would also later shed light on some other aspects of the game's design, like how battles were intended to last no longer than 90 seconds each, just to make sure players would not tire themselves out. You can also see how they streamlined the gameplay when it comes to things like platforming, as there is no ability to jump. Instead, when there is a gap for the player to cross, a context-sensitive icon appears, and your character jumps automatically. Due to these sort of compromises, some players may feel like the game is a bit too guided. Luckily, it really shines in the one area it really focuses on, the combat. First up is the new approach to the game's controls. By 2010, other first-person shooters had come along on the Wii since Red Steel, and they nailed the aspect of aiming. Many even allowed for a ton of customization options, which is exactly the case here. You have complete control over things like dead zone, bounding box, turning speed, cursor sensitivity, swing strength, and the list goes on. Really cool stuff. And despite the game equipping you with guns, the term first-person brawler is actually right on the money. And though you are required to make certain gestures with the Wii Remote to execute these special moves, they really do function more like elaborate button presses than anything. Meaning as long as you do the basic movements required, the moves will work. There's no need for you to ever worry about having perfect form. The moveset provided to you also comes in a nice variety. There's everything from basic slashes to a projectile that stuns your enemies to a move straight out of anime, where you send your foe flying into the air and jump up to slash them back to the ground. There are even finishers that give you a big reward at the end of each fight. It all adds up to be very fun and fluid once you get the hang of it. And thankfully, no matter what's happening on screen, the game rarely drops below 50 FPS. A stark contrast compared to the first game, which dipped into the teens on a regular basis. And just like the first game, this one has another killer soundtrack, accentuating perfectly that Japanese Western theme. The game's progression system, however, is a bit more typical. As I touched on earlier, throughout your adventure, you will meet characters who basically only exist to teach you moves or to sell you items, armor, sword upgrades, and guns. You select both main and side missions from a bulletin board, and you get money by completing these missions, killing enemies, and breaking items in the world, which is strangely addictive. There's also a safe cracking minigame that has you hold the Wii Remote up to your head and listen to the controller's speaker to find out when you're supposed to release the lock. As you might expect, the further you get into the story, the more moves and guns you unlock, and the more powerful you become. Likewise, your enemies also become more powerful and have weak points you'll need to exploit, which forces you to use a bit of strategy and not just go into every fight flailing your arm like crazy. You'll also notice that, like the first game, this one has no blood and gore, but I feel like it makes much more sense this time around due to the fact that it looks like a cartoon. Overall, it's a very unique but satisfying experience, and it still holds up incredibly well. The only downsides are that the Motion Plus itself can sometimes be a little wonky, and you have to sit still for a second while pointing at the screen so it can recalibrate itself. There's also an option to recalibrate in the menu, but I never really needed to use that. Another downside is that you're stuck with a mini-map in the corner you can never get rid of. Other than that, though, it's pretty solid all around and does a good job keeping you interested. And critics generally agree. The game has an 80 on Metacritic and a pretty positive overall reputation. It's honestly a shame then that it didn't do very well financially. It's said to have sold slightly more than 250,000 copies within its first few months, and was ultimately deemed a failure, which sadly didn't surprise the developers.
It didn't necessarily surprise us that this happened. We were Wii Motion Plus exclusive. You had to have the Wii Motion Plus to play. So in this model, you have everyone, people with a console, and then there's the people who have the peripheral.
10 to 20% of the audience. That's not a large number.
And then there's people interested in the game. Each of these circles reduces the number of people who can buy your game. How many people were interested in Red Steel 2 when they saw it? And how many people bought it? Yeah, that's what I thought.
As a result of the game's poor sales, the series disappeared, forever stuck on the Wii as a relic of the past. But what if you want to play the game today? What's the best way to do that? Well, first you'll need either a Wii Remote with a Motion Plus attachment, or one of these Wii Remotes that had Motion Plus built in. From there, you can probably guess where this is headed. We move over to the PC. Like the first Red Steel, the second is compatible with the emulator known as Dolphin. And despite having a much different aesthetic, Red Steel 2 also cleans up very well. I think this is mostly due to the rather simplistic art style. It also runs at a solid 60 FPS without the need for a hack, because that's just what it targets natively. There are a few quirks though, like the pre-rendered cutscenes appear corrupted if you have texture filtering on, so yeah, it's not perfect, but still, it's a good way to experience the game if you have the required PC hardware to do so. Heck, you can even play the game now without Motion Plus, as the emulator allows the option to emulate the add-on with a normal controller. I haven't tried this myself, but it's interesting nonetheless. And it's quite honestly amazing to see just how much this emulator has improved over the years. If you ask me, Red Steel as a series is about as interesting as it gets, because if you really think about it, both entries in the franchise had the opportunity to break new ground in gaming. Honestly, how many other franchises can make that claim? The amazing thing about the second one, though, is how it took the failures of the first and turned them into strengths, while completely reinventing itself in the process. The end result was a game that stood out at the time, but sadly failed to get much attention. But despite its failure to find an audience, it definitely deserves to be remembered as one of the Wii's best third-party games, if not one of the best games on the system overall. Yeah, it can be repetitive, yeah, it holds your hand a little too much, and yeah, it could have used a true New Game Plus mode, but two things it definitely is not are boring and generic. And that, honestly, is one of the biggest compliments I feel any game can ever receive from me. Here's hoping Red Steel may someday be given another chance to shine.